Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will make a statement. I'm grateful to Sue Gray for her report today, and I want to thank her for the work that she's done. I also thank the Metropolitan Police for completing their investigation, and I want to begin today by renewing my apology to the House, to the whole country, for the short lunchtime gathering on the 19th of June 2020 in the Cabinet Room, during which I stood at my place at the Cabinet table and for which I received a fixed penalty notice. And I also want to say, Mr. Speaker, above all, that I take full responsibility for everything that took place on my watch. Sue Gray's report has emphasised that it is up to the political leadership in Number 10 to take ultimate responsibility, and of course I do. But since these investigations have now come to an end, this is my first opportunity to set out some of the context and to explain both my understanding of what happened and also to explain what I have previously said to this House. And it's important to set out that over a period of about 600 days, gatherings on a total of 8 dates have been found to be in breach of the regulations in a building that is 5,300 metres square across 5 floors, excluding the flats. Mr. Speaker, I do think it is important because this is the first time I've had a chance I've had to set out the context. Hundreds of staff are entitled to work, and in the Cabinet Office, which has thousands of officials and now is the biggest it's been in any point in its 100-year history. And that is in itself one of the reasons why the government is now looking for change and reform. Mr. Speaker, those staff working in Downing Street were permitted to continue attending their office for the purpose of work, and the exemption under the regulations applied to their work because of the nature of their jobs reporting directly to the Prime Minister. These people were working extremely long hours, doing their best to give this country the ability to fight the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that this is no mitigation, but it is important to set out
Prime Minister,
context.
please, just one second. Can I just appeal to the House? I expect it to be heard, and I want everybody to hear it. And I want the same respect to be shown to the Leader of the Opposition afterwards. So please, this is a very, very important statement that the country wants to hear as well. Prime Minister.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to set out the context, not to mitigate or to absolve myself in any way. The exemption under which they were present in Downing Street includes those circumstances where officials and advisers were leaving the government. And it was appropriate to recognise them, to thank them for the work that they have done. Let me come to that, Mr. Speaker. I briefly attended such gatherings to thank them for their service, which I believe is one of the essential duties of leadership, and particularly important when people need to feel that their contributions have been appreciated and to keep morale as high as possible. I'm trying to explain the reasons I was there, Mr. Speaker. And it's clear from what Sue Gray has had to say that some of these gatherings then went on far longer than was necessary. And they were clearly in breach of the rules, and they fell foul of the rules. I have to tell the House, because the House will need to know this, and again, this is not to mitigate or to extenuate, I had no knowledge of those subsequent proceedings because I simply wasn't there. And I have been as surprised and disappointed as anyone else in this House as the revelations have unfolded. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, I have been appalled by some of the behaviour, particularly in the treatment of the security and the cleaning staff. And I would like to apologise to those members of staff. And I expect anyone who behaved in that way to apologise to them as well. And I'm happy to set on the record now that when I said, and I came to this House and said in all sincerity that the rules and guidance had been followed at all times, it was what I believed to be true. It was certainly the case when I was present at gatherings to wish staff farewell And the House will note that my attendance at these moments, brief as it was, has not been found to be outside the rules. But clearly this was not the case for some of those gatherings after I had left and at other gatherings when I was not even in the building. So I would like to correct the record, to take this opportunity, not in any sense to absolve myself of responsibility, which I take and have always taken, but simply to explain why I spoke as I did in this House. Mr. Speaker, in response to her interim report, Sue Gray acknowledges that very significant changes have already been enacted. She writes, and I quote, "I am pleased that progress is being made in addressing the issues I raised." And she adds, "Since my update, there have been changes to the organisation and management of Downing Street in the Cabinet Office with the aim of creating clearer lines of leadership and accountability, and now these need the chance and time to bed in." Number 10 now has its own permanent secretary charged with applying the highest standards of governance. There are now easier ways for staff to voice any worries, and Sue Gray welcomes that, and I quote, "Steps have since been taken to introduce more easily accessible means by which to raise concerns electronically, in person or online, including directly with the permanent secretary." The entire senior management has changed. There is a new chief of staff, an elected member of this House, who also commands the status of a cabinet minister. There is a new director of communications, a new principal private secretary, and another of other key appointments in my office. I am confident with the changes and new structures that are now in place, that we are humbled by the experience, and we have learned our lesson. And I want to conclude by saying that Mr. Speaker, I am humbled and I have learned a lesson, Mr. Speaker. And I want to conclude by saying that whatever the failings of we'll come to that. And whatever the failings of Number 10 and the Cabinet Office throughout this very difficult period, for which I take full responsibility, I continue to believe that the civil servants and advisers in question, hundreds of them, thousands of them, some of whom, Mr. Speaker, are the very people who've received fines, are good, hard-working people, motivated by the highest calling to do the very best for our country. And I will always be proud of what they achieved, including procuring essential life-saving PPE, creating the biggest testing program in Europe, and helping to enable the development and distribution of the vaccine which got this country through the worst pandemic of a century. And now, Mr. Speaker, we must get our country through the aftershocks of COVID with every ounce of ingenuity and compassion and hard work. So I hope that today, as well as learning the lessons from Sue Gray's report, which I'm glad I commissioned, and again, I repeat I'm grateful to her. And I hope very much that now that she has reported, we will be able to move on and focus on the priorities of the British people, standing firm against Russian aggression, easing the hardship caused by the rising costs that people are facing, fulfilling our pledges to generate a high-wage, high-skill, high-employment economy that will unite and level up across the whole of our United Kingdom. That is my mission, that is our mission, that is the mission of the whole of the government, and we will work day and night to deliver it, and I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The door of Number 10 Downing Street is one of the great symbols of our democracy. Those who live behind it exercise great power, but they do so knowing their stay is temporary. long after they've gone, that door and the democracy it represents will remain firm and unyielding. But Britain's constitution is fragile. It relies on members of this House and the custodians of number 10 behaving responsibly, honestly, and in the interests of the British people. When our leaders fall short of these standards, this House has to act. For months, members opposite have asked the country to wait. First, for the police investigation, which concluded that this Prime Minister is the first in our country's history to have broken the law in office. Then they asked the country to wait for the Sue Gray report. They need wait no longer. That report lays bare the rot that under this Prime Minister has spread in number 10. And it provides definitive proof of how those within the building treated the sacrifices of the British people with utter contempt. When the dust settles and the anger subsides, this report will stand as a monument to the hubris and the arrogance of a government that believed it was one rule for them and another rule for everyone else. The details are stark. 5 months ago, the Prime Minister told this House all guidance was completely followed in number 10. Yet we now know he attended events on the 17th of December. At least one of those attending has received a fine for it, deeming it illegal. We know that on the 18th of December, an event was held in which staff drank excessively, which others in the building described as a party, and that cleaners were left to mop up the red wine the next day. On the 20th of May, as a COVID press conference was taking place, one of his senior officials was told, "Be mindful, cameras are leaving, don't walk about waving bottles." It is now impossible to defend the Prime Minister's words to this House. This is about trust. Because during that May 20 press conference, the British public were told normal life as we know it is a long way off. But that wasn't the case in number 10. Even now, after 126 fines, they think it's everyone else's fault but theirs. They expect others to take the blame whilst they cling on. They pretend that the Prime Minister has somehow been exonerated, as if the fact that he only broke the law once is worthy of praise. The truth is, they set the bar for his conduct lower than a snake's belly. And now they expect the rest of us to congratulate him as he stumbles over it. Number 10 symbolises the principles of public life in this country: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, leadership. But who could read this report and honestly believe the Prime Minister has upheld those standards? The reason the British public have had to endure this farce was his refusal to admit the truth or do the decent thing when he was found to have broken the law. This report was necessary because of what Sue Gray describes as failures of leadership and judgment for which senior political leadership must bear responsibility. It is that failure of leadership that has now left his government paralysed in the middle of a cost of living crisis. The government has turned the focus of his government to saving his own skin. It's utterly shameful. It is precisely because he cannot lead that it falls to others to do so. I've been clear what leadership looks like. I haven't broken any rules, and any attempt to compel...
Sorry. Can I just calm it down? Quite rightly, I wanted to the Prime Minister. I expect the same of the Leader of the Opposition. Now, those who don't wish to hear, please, go and have a cup of tea or something. Kiss Stammer.
I've been clear what leadership looks like. I haven't broken any rules, and any attempt to compare a perfectly legal takeaway while working to this catalogue of criminality looks even more ridiculous today. But, Mr. Speaker, if the police decide otherwise, I will do the decent thing and step down. The public need to know that not all politicians are the same. That not all politicians put themselves above their country. That honesty, integrity and accountability matter. Members on the opposite benches now also need to show leadership. This Prime Minister is steering the country in the wrong direction. They can hide in the back seat, eyes covered, praying for a miracle, or they can act. Stop this out of touch, out of control Prime Minister from driving Britain towards disaster. We waited for the Sue Gray report. The country can't wait any longer. The values symbolised by the door of number 10 must be restored. Members opposite must finally do their bit. They must tell the current inhabitant, their leader, that this has gone on too long. The game is up. You cannot be a lawmaker and a lawbreaker. And it's time to pack his bags. Only then can the government function again. Only then can the rot be carved out. Only then can we restore the dignity of that great office and the democracy that it represents.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman talks about what went on in number 10 Downing Street and the events behind that black door, and the number of the events. And all I will say to him is that he, throughout the pandemic, was not leading many thousands of people in the fight against coronavirus. He was sniping from the sidelines and veering from one position to the next. And today, Mr. Speaker, he's done it again. Week after week, he could have come to this House and talked about the economy, about Ukraine, about the cost of living. No, Mr. Speaker, time after time, he chose to focus on this issue. He could have shown some common sense, Mr. Speaker, and recognised that when people are working very hard together, day in, day out, that it can be difficult to draw the boundary, Mr. Speaker, between work and socialising. And yet, after months of his, frankly, sanctimonious obsession, Mr. Speaker, the great gaseous zeppelin of his pomposity has been permanently punctured and irretrievably by the revelation that he is himself, he didn't mention this, he is himself under investigation by the police, Mr. Speaker, and yet, I'm not going to mince my words, I've got to say this, Sabir Korma, Mr. Speaker, is currently failing to hold himself to the same high standards that he demanded of me. It's true. He called for me to resign, Mr. Speaker, when the investigation began. Why is he in his place?
Mr. Holden, it's the second time. Please help me to help you, because I'm sure you want to hear the rest of it. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he should at least be consistent and hold himself to the same standards. He's still there, and so is the shadow deputy leader. And Mr. Speaker, I apologise when the revelations emerged. I continue to apologise. I repeat that I am humbled by what has happened, and we have instituted profound changes throughout number 10. But I think in view of the mess that he has found himself in himself, it would now be a sensible thing for him too to apologise, so that we can all... so that we can all collectively move on, Mr. Speaker. And that, I think, is what the people of this country want to see above all. They want to see leadership from this House of Commons, leadership from both parties, Mr. Speaker, in dealing with their priorities. And that is why we are focused on getting through the aftershocks of COVID. That's why I'm proud of what we did to roll out the fastest vaccine campaign in Europe. And that's why I'm proud that we now have the lowest unemployment anywhere in this country for 50 years, Mr. Speaker. That is what the people of this country want. I appreciate that he has his points to make, but I think overwhelmingly the will of this country is for us now to say thank you to Sue Gray, and for us collectively to move on.
Sir Robert Buckland.
You, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend well knows the rules apply to him as much to all of us. And the rules of this House are clear that anybody who comes here and deliberately lies and misleads this House should leave their position, resign or apologise. My right honourable friend has been asked many times about specific incidents, specific events that Sue Gray has outlined. Has he on any occasion come to this House in response to specific questions about specific events and deliberately lied to us?
No, Mr. Speaker, for the reason I have given, that at the time that I spoke to this House, I believe that what I was doing was to attend work events, and with the exception of the event in the Cabinet room, that is a view that has been vindicated by the investigation.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I speak, the public is poring over the sordid details of what went on out of the public eye, behind the high gates and the walls of the Prime Minister's residence, and the report is damning. It concludes, many gatherings and many individuals did not adhere to COVID guidance. Events were attended by leaders in government and should not have been allowed to happen. Junior civil servants believed their involvement was permitted by the attendance of senior leaders. There was an unacceptable lack of respect and poor treatment of security and cleaning staff. And crucially, Mr. Speaker, the senior leadership at the centre, both political and official, must bear responsibility for this culture. That leadership came from the top. And the Prime Minister, in the words of the report, must bear responsibility for the culture. A fish rots from the head. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's dispatch box denial of a party taking place on the 13th of November is now proven to be untrue. He was there on the 13th of November, photographed, raising a toast, surrounded by gin, wine and other revellers. The charge of misleading Parliament is a resignation matter. Will the Prime Minister now finally resign? This Prime Minister has adopted a systematic, concerted and sinister pattern of evasion. Truthfulness, honesty and transparency do not enter his vocabulary. It is just not part of his way of being, and it speaks for the type of man that he is. Credibility, truth, morality all matter, and the Prime Minister has been found lacking time and time again, and he can shake his head, but that's the reality, Prime Minister. Ethics have to be part of our public life, and ethical behaviour has to be at the core of the demeanour and the response of any Prime Minister. The Prime Minister brings shame on the office and has displayed contempt not only to the members of this House, but to every single person who followed the rules. They stayed away from family, those who missed funerals, those who lost someone they loved. So when the Tory members opposite retire to the 1922 committee this evening, I hope they will bear in mind the now infamous government advert featuring a desperately ill COVID patient. It said, "Look into her eyes and tell her you never bend the rules." If they don't submit a letter, if they don't remove this Prime Minister, how will they ever look at their constituents in the eye ever again?
Mr. Speaker, I think that the Right Honourable Gentleman should look closely at Sue Gray's report, and I repeat my thanks to her. I stress that the nature and length of my involvement in these events is very clear from what she says, and I take full responsibility for what happened. And that is why we've taken the steps that we have to reform and improve the way Number 10 works. We are humbled by what has happened, and we have changed it.
Peter Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since I've been elected to this House, I've been running a campaign called Listening to Wellingborough and Rushden. And you may recall on one occasion that group asked me to present a letter at PMQ calling for a previous Prime Minister to resign. What they're telling me today, Mr. Speaker, is their concerns are the terrible war in Ukraine, the illegal immigrants crossing the Channel, and the economy. And their message to the Prime Minister is to get on with the job. Does he agree with the Listening to Wellingborough and Rushden campaign?
I agree with it. I agree with them profoundly and passionately, Mr. Speaker, and that's exactly what I'm going to do.
Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said that on the 13th of November 2020, the ABBA party he attended briefly, his defence was a job interview. Can he confirm he was only in his flat and he met Henry Newman to discuss a job? And can he confirm what the other special advisers were doing? Were they part of the job interview as well?
Mr. Speaker, that evening was extensively investigated, to the best of my knowledge, and I don't believe I can improve on what Sue Gray has had to say.
Tobias Selwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a damning report about the absence of leadership, focus and discipline in Number 10, the one place where you expect to find those attributes in abundance. I made my point and my position very clear to the Prime Minister. He does not have my support. But a question I humbly put to my colleagues is, are you willing, day in and day out, to defend this behaviour publicly? Can we continue to govern without distraction, given the erosion of the trust with the British people? And can we win the general election on this current trajectory? The question I place to the Prime Minister is now, Mr. Speaker, I'm being heckled by my own people. If we cannot work out what we're going to do, then the broad church of the Conservative Party will lose the next general election. But my question to the Prime Minister is very clear on the question of leadership. Can he think of any other Prime Minister who would have allowed such a culture of indiscipline to take place under their watch? And if it did, would they not have resigned?
Mr. Speaker, I think to answer the question that he put to all of us on these benches, I think the answer is overwhelmingly and emphatically yes, we are going to go on and win the next general election because we're going to get on with the job, Mr. Speaker.
Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says he's sorry, but he's only sorry he got caught. He didn't care then, as he parted during lockdown, when people couldn't see their dying loved ones. He didn't care last year when he insisted that no rules had been broken. And he doesn't care now when families across our country are struggling to heat their homes, fill their cars and put feed on the table, with a cost of living crisis that has only deepened while the Prime Minister has been scrambling to save his own skin. So, Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister look the British people in the eye and name one person, just one person, he cares about more than himself?
Mr. Speaker, I can tell him that there are people in number 10 Downing Street, including me, who cared passionately about making sure that we had the PPE that we needed, we had the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, and that we protected this country from COVID. And that is what people were doing. And I may say that the abuse that has been directed at civil servants and officials is, I think, wholly unwarranted.
Robert Gentry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I think of civil servants and advisers during that period, I think of the brilliant civil servants who helped move mountains to create the shielding programme within a matter of days. I think of the brilliant civil servants and advisers that got 90% of homeless people off the streets within days. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that these achievements and others should mean that nothing in this report is a stain upon the character of the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of civil servants, whether in number 10, other government departments, or across the country, who helped steer this country through the pandemic? And secondly, difficult though this is to say for many, with a war in Europe, with an economic crisis, with the challenges this country faces, is it not really true that it is now time to turn a page, and for this country, our politics and this House to move forwards?
I agree with him absolutely passionately, Mr. Speaker. I think the best thing, I think we can study the report, we can draw the conclusions that we want. The best thing now for our country is to move forwards together, and that's what we're going to do.
Dame Angela Riedel.
Mr. Speaker, we all understand, and the Prime Minister understands, that not being truthful on the floor of this House requires a resignation. My honourable friend, the member for Hornsey and Wood Green, asked the Prime Minister a point-blank question on the floor of this House when he was at that dispatch box. She asked him if he had been to a party on the 13th of November in 10 Downing Street. He said he hadn't and that no party had happened. There are 4 pictures of it. There are 4 pictures of it, Mr. Speaker, featured in the Sue Gray report. Will the Prime Minister account now on the floor of the House for his answer to that very specific question?
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, and I tried to do it in what I said earlier on, and the answer is that it's part of my job to say thank you to people who work in government. That's what I was doing. I believed it was a work event, and indeed there has been no fine issued to me as a result of my attendance at that event, because that is what I was doing.
Continue.
Mr. Speaker, I commend Sue Gray for the report, and I do understand why people are angry. Having looked at the pictures of the birthday party in the Cabinet Office, I think the opposition are going to be quite hard-pressed to explain why they have such moral outrage about that, but not about the late-night beers that happened at Downing. However, one of the things I was very troubled by was the language that was used towards the custodian. Would the Prime Minister join with me now, and I'm sure the whole House would agree, the level of respect and gratitude that we have to every single cleaner and worker and all the people in the tea room that work in this place? Thank you, sir.
I thank her very, very much, and I agree very much with what she has just said. And I think that as I said in my opening statement, Mr. Speaker, I think the behaviour towards any rudeness towards a member of staff is absolutely inexcusable, and I want whoever was responsible to apologise.
Tamanjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I feel as if I have completely let down those who showered me with so much love. Why wasn't I by the bedside of my lovely grandmother during her final few days? Why did I let her die alone in that hospital? Why did I not attend the funeral of my uncle because of worries about government restrictions on numbers? And why did I not go to comfort my brother-in-law's father as he was dying in a Slough care home? Why, with all of this context, it is utterly hypocritical for those individuals who were preaching to us ad nauseum about patriotism, the flag and the Queen, for those very people to then be having late-night parties, including 2 on the night before the Queen had to sit all alone during her husband's funeral when the country was in a state of national mourning. Absolutely shameless. So, Prime Minister, given that the Prime Minister is not going to do the right and honourable thing, does he agree with me that it is not the support and sympathy of the British people that is keeping him in power, the majority of whom want him to resign? It is the support and sympathy of those concerned...
Order! Order! I'm sorry, but it's meant to be a question, and also we don't normally bring monarch into proceedings. And I'm sure that the Prime Minister will have got the gist, and quite rightly, I understand the emotions behind it, but it's going to be short of Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry for the honourable gentleman's loss, and he has a perfect right to speak with the passion that he does. All I can say is that I take full responsibility for what happened. I do, and we have made extensive changes.
John Barron.
Mr. Speaker, I believe both leaders have a lot to answer for with regards to this issue. The British Army teaches you, or certainly believes at its very core, that you serve to lead and you lead by example. Given the extent of rule-breaking in Number 10, does my right honourable friend believe that what he has said to the House since about there being no rule-breaking passed the test of reasonableness?
I think he's asking exactly the right question, and I understand why he asks it. But I've tried to give my answer to him and to the House, which is that I believe that I was attending work events. Those are the ones of which I had knowledge, and with the exception of what took place in the cabinet room in June of 2020, that view has been sustained by the investigation.
Janet Cherry.
Speaker, neither I nor my Edinburgh South West constituents would wish to live in a state where the government of the day could influence the police in the exercise of their duty to investigate without fear or favour. So we're puzzled as to why the Prime Minister didn't receive questionnaires in respect of 3 gatherings where other people in Number 10 received questionnaires. And we're also puzzled as to why the ABBA party in the Prime Minister's flat has never been investigated either by Sue Gray or the Metropolitan Police. So can I ask the Prime Minister what can be done by way of an independent investigation to assure me and my constituents that the Metropolitan Police have not been nobbled?
Well, that would greatly surprise me, Mr. Speaker, but I think she should look more closely at Sue Gray's report, because I think she will find the answer she needs.
Michael Babrickan.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the outrage of people in Lichfield and Burntwood, and indeed the honourable gentleman opposite, who have lost loved ones. But I also understand, having been an employer, that attending an event where someone is leaving is considered to be a working event. And my right honourable friend clearly got guidance that turned out to be wrong. So can he now explain how the appointment of a new permanent secretary at Number 10 will make a difference in the future?
I thank him very much, and what we're doing is not only the structure of Number 10 has changed, so there's more direct command and control for the whole building, which was a little bit unclear before. And so there is a new permanent secretary with direct responsibility for the whole office, as it were, hundreds and hundreds of people, as opposed to that function being nominally to be addressed by the principal private secretary. And the lines of, as Sue Gray said, the lines of command were not clear. Sue Gray.
Coulter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After months of shuffling around, prevarication and book passing, this report makes it absolutely clear that when the British public were taking those restrictions seriously, the Prime Minister was taking the British public for fools. That's why the Prime Minister and his government cannot now be taken seriously. Isn't it time he said goodbye so that the rest of us could say good riddance?
Mr. Speaker, I really don't think that the government can be blamed for the delay that he complains of. It took a long time for the Met to do their work. It was exhaustive, and I don't believe that it sustains the conclusion that he has drawn. Not at all.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I asked the Prime Minister about Sue Gray's interim findings on the 31st of January, he asked me to wait for the inquiry report. He asked many members that day to do the same thing. Subsequently, he has asked the media to wait for the findings of the report, and he knows that many colleagues on these benches have told their constituents they're waiting for the inquiry report. So I was very surprised to read in the Times the intimation that he may have asked Sue Gray not to publish the report at all. Is there any truth to that suggestion, Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, what Sue Gray has published is entirely for Sue Gray, and it is a wholly independent report, Mr. Speaker.
Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, the last time I asked the Prime Minister a question on this subject, I said the problem with him, and I've got on with him over the years, is he is a serial offender. And even serial offenders, if they actually confess that they've done wrong and then repent for what they've done, they can actually be forgiven because they're mending their ways. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but today's performance from the Prime Minister shows no real remorse, trying to shift the buck on other people, and I believe now, with many faces I see on the other side, that he should now resign.
Mr. Speaker, I've apologised, and I am, as I have said, deeply contrite about what happened. I take responsibility. We are affecting and have done a huge amount of change already in number 10, but it is my judgment that the best thing for the country is now to move on from this issue and to learn the lessons.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Given the cavalier way in which these rules were interpreted in number 10, does my right honourable friend agree that rules of such intrusiveness and rigidity must never again be imposed on the British people as a whole?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we were dealing with a pandemic that was absolutely unprecedented, and we did not have any immediate tools to control it short of a vaccine without asking people to restrict their behaviour. I'm sure there are plenty of lessons we can learn from the future about how to do it better, and I'm sure that would be a matter for the inquiry.
Angus Brendan MacNeill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. While he is still unwittingly a great asset for Scottish independence, the question everywhere, however, is how to goodness is he still Prime Minister of this current United Kingdom?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the answer to that question is contained in the continued support of the people of the United Kingdom for our union, and despite everything that they are doing to try to overturn the democratic verdict of 2014, I don't believe that they will succeed.
Natalie Elphie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his further apology and his explanation today, which is important for many of my constituents. Does he note paragraph 4 of page 36 of the Sue Gray report that says, there have been changes to the organisation and management of Downing Street and the Cabinet Office with the aim of creating clearer lines of leadership and accountability? And does he agree with her that these changes need to bed in and that the focus of our government must be laser-like in tackling the cost of living crisis that has come about as a result of the COVID pandemic and Ukraine, and that this is the concern over and above everything else of my constituents?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the General Opposite says answered. I will. I agree. I agree completely with what she has just said, and that's why we're going to get on with the job.
Chris Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What a load of baloney.
So Boris Johnson answering questions in the House of Commons following the Sue Gray report. Let's listen to Chris Bryant.
Fools. The truth is, the Prime Minister encouraged the gatherings. He attended the gatherings. He poured the drinks at the gatherings. And he even raised a toast at the gatherings. So he knew perfectly well that these gatherings had taken place. And the most despicable thing of all is that Sue Gray says she saw multiple examples of a lack of respect and poor treatment of security and cleaning staff because they knew what the rules meant, even if nobody else does. Does he show no contrition, no sense of shame that Downing Street under him has been a cesspit full of arrogant, entitled narcissists?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said to the House already, I think that it is absolutely disgraceful in any circumstances to be rude to people who are helping you, and rude to staff, rude to custodians. It's intolerable, and I will make sure that those who are guilty of it apologise or are otherwise disciplined.
Jack Brereton.
Mr. Speaker, now we've...
Well, we were just stepping away for a moment from that. Chris Bryan giving quite a strong response to the Prime Minister there. So the Prime Minister's answering questions about the Sue Gray report. He made a statement to the House. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, is here with me. Beth, let's just, I suppose, quickly just remind ourselves what the key findings of the Sue Gray report are.
Well, I think the key findings, if you boil this 37-page report down, is that senior leadership must bear responsibility for behaviours that will dismay many. And she also said that junior members of staff felt compelled at times to have to go to events. I think within the report, you have a catalogue of different parties, law-breaking parties. You have lurid details of drunkenness, minor altercations, people rolling out on a couple of different events at 3 or 4 in the morning at a time when the rest of the country was in lockdown. So it's embarrassing, it's damning of the culture of government. What's interesting within Sue Gray's report is she says she doesn't believe it was the prevailing culture of government and the civil service. And the unspoken implication of that is she believes it was a culture that existed specifically under Boris Johnson. I think that's the meaning I take from that. Just in terms of where it leaves the Prime Minister, I think it's fair to say that in terms of the report, it shows senior staff with premeditation of events, acknowledgement of getting away with it. I mean, Martin Reynolds, his former private secretary, said, "We got away with it," referring to the May 20th event. But there's no actual smoking gun of the Prime Minister at one of these events late into the night, drinking, etc. And his defence, you heard it in the Commons there, was that these events went awry after he left and he was working. I think that's his defence. In terms of what's just happened in the Commons, I think the Prime Minister is trying to stress there that the apology is there again. He says the entire management has changed. But I think what's also clear is that apart from the two people at the top, the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, is still there and the Prime Minister is still there. So when Sue Gray says the leadership politically and officially must take responsibility, it doesn't mean the top two leaders, although he was pressed on that. Where does it leave him with MPs? I think there's a couple of things. One MP has just messaged me and said, it's interesting how few colleagues are willing to go on the benches today and defend him publicly. You saw that Tobias Ellwood, who has publicly called for the Prime Minister's resignation, a former Minister, chair of the Select Committee, called the Prime Minister out. He said to colleagues, how can you keep defending this behaviour? Warned that they would lose the next election under Johnson. He said to the Prime Minister, would another Prime Minister entertain this behaviour and not resign? But the PM is facing it down. You can see from his response that he genuinely thinks that these work events, he thinks he's been vindicated by the fact he hasn't had penalty notices. And the acid test really is, what do his MPs do now? It's up to them whether they try to force a vote of confidence in him or not. But in terms of the report, do I think there's been a material moment in this report that has changed the prospects for him? I think everything that's been revealed here is kind of what we already knew, apart from the details and also some of the actual text messages with the senior civil staff. I mean, sharing premeditation
and behaviour towards cleaners and behaviour towards staff, which is awful. Yeah. Right. Well, let's return to the House of Commons. Just to let you know, also a timetable for the afternoon. At about 3:30, the Prime Minister is going to make a press statement. That will happen at 3:30 this afternoon. We'll bring you that live, of course. But for now, let's return to the House of Commons.
Mr. McGovern.
Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that the Prime Minister has any credibility left, because my constituents tell me that they don't believe what he says. So I want to ask the Prime Minister about what I think to be the bare minimum in this situation. When it comes to the cleaning staff and the security staff in number 10 treated with a lack of respect, has the Prime Minister personally apologised to them?
I thank her. This is the first that I've seen of the detailed criticisms of civil servants for that abuse. I've said that I think it's intolerable, and I will make sure that staff, custodians, cleaners who were treated disrespectfully get a proper apology. I've apologised to them today. I've apologised to them today already from this dispatch box.
Rarely in my 21 years in this House have I heard such utter drivel than what we've been presented today. I've tried to find words to capture what the Prime Minister said. Disingenuous, delusional, slippery, self-serving, and I know I can't say this one is in this place. No attempt at remorse, all somebody else's fault. Surely if he was half the man that he thinks he is, he would summon that self-respect and just go.
I direct him to what I've already said.
Barbara Keeler.
Speaker, I want to quote the following to the Prime Minister and all those on his side. We've just heard one who want to suggest the COVID rules didn't matter. It's from palliative care doctor, Dr. Rachel Clark. To NHS staff, it was abundantly clear that the way you survive a pandemic is together. In 2020, collective compliance was all NHS patients had to protect them. Basic, selfless public decency mattered. Rules were hated but obeyed because we care about each other. And that glass of wine in the PM's hand, it's been thrown in the face of all of us. How does he reply to that?
Mr. Speaker, I wish things could have been handled better, and I wish things we got things right in number 10 in the way that we didn't. And I apologise again for things that got wrong, but we've already changed the way we work, and I really think it's time that the country moved on.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Speaker, the Prime Minister has previously stated that Partygate investigations would be fully complied with, but today there are reports that senior staff simply didn't answer the questionnaires and as a result have avoided being fined. Can the Prime Minister therefore confirm whether all senior staff at number 10, including himself, met their obligations and replied to the Metropolitan Police in full?
As she knows, those are a matter for the Met.
Nasha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said, I briefly attended such gatherings to thank them for their service, which I believe is one of the essential duties of leadership. He wouldn't need no leadership if it hit him in the face from where my constituents stand. And I'll tell him why. Because there's doctors who gave their lives. Their families weren't allowed to attend their funerals. I was on the phone when the trust I work with had to make decisions of leadership to separate people from not being able to see their dying relatives. I was on the phone to somebody whilst they died, begging me to let them see him. That's what leadership is, when those were difficult decisions they had to make, when nurses couldn't go home and had to book into hotels so they didn't spread infections. So if he had an ounce of leadership, he'd resign, so why doesn't he?
I refer her to what I've already said.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's credibility is like a slow puncture. He reinflates it occasionally, but isn't the truth? His party needs a new front wheel.
Mr. Speaker, I think they really need to ask a new question.
Kate Land.
I have to say I'm absolutely appalled by the behaviour of some members in this chamber today. They're refusing to accept responsibility. They're jeering and cheering and saying, let's move on. Well, can I tell you, Prime Minister, there's a young man in Blackburn who can't move on because due to a wart on his head, rather than getting an appointment with a doctor, he was asked to send in a picture. 3 months later, he was actually told he had stage 4 cancer. So the impact is widespread, the damage is long-lasting, and this young man cannot even get the treatment because they say they won't fund it. Does the Prime Minister feel no shame that he just totally trashed rules that he made, expected other people to live with? He wants to move on and other people are left with the consequences. Surely the Prime Minister must resign.
No, Mr. Speaker, we want to get on with addressing the COVID backlogs, which is what we're doing.
Hello.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I sometimes wonder if the Prime Minister has a neck of pure brass. Does he understand and recognise the words honesty, integrity and accountability?
No.
Because from my position, I don't think he does. Many members have spoken of personal things and personal tragedies they've gone through. The country needs a new leader. Yes, we need to move on, but we shouldn't need to lead on with you, Prime Minister. Will you now resign?
Mr. Speaker, I think that I'm just going to repeat my previous answer.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's leadership, his behaviour drives the culture in our politics, but also in our country. And it also gives licence to others to behave in a similar matter. So if he is genuine in his apology, and he's not, will he firstly ensure that the ministerial and members' codes have the Nolan principles incorporated into them and put them on the statute? And secondly, will he condemn those Oldham Conservative candidates who delivered toxic, racist, misogynistic leaflets during the recent local elections? His chairman has details of that.
I'd be very happy to look at those details if she'll send them to me.
Carol Monaghan. Right, let's pick somebody else. Dan Jarvis.
Serve to lead. That's the motto of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. And everybody serving in our armed forces knows that if the commanding officer of a unit had presided over the kind of shambles we'd seen in Downing Street, they would be discharged of their duties. Why is it different from the Prime Minister?
Is he referring to the vaccine programme, the PPE securing, or the fact that we came out of COVID faster than any other European country?
Anand Kesar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A comment that sickened me from the Sue Gray report was, and I quote, "I was made aware of multiple examples of a lack of respect and poor treatment of security and cleaning staff. The Prime Minister has made a public apology at the dispatch box, but when will he personally apologise to those hard-working cleaning staff who risked every day to ensure that everyone was kept safe?"
I thank her very much, and just to repeat what I said both earlier on and to the honourable lady opposite, when I've identified the custodians, the cleaners, the staff in question, of course I will talk to them myself.
Dr. Rupa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One address, 20 months, 204 questionnaires, 345 documents, 510 photos, including the ones on page 38 onwards, of him raising a toast when he should be toast. And as a result of this, 126 fines, mostly to 83 junior staffers, while all the while the police were routinely fining people greater amounts than his 50 quid for far lesser offences. Doesn't this all point to a conclusion that not everyone is as equal under the law as each other these days?
I think that there's a criticism of the Metropolitan Police contained in what she's just said, which I don't agree with.
Karen Smith.
The problem with this report, Mr. Speaker, is the dates outlined so clearly reopen many of our wounds. But I'm going to ask the Prime Minister a question that has been asked earlier that he didn't answer, from the member for Newcastle under Lyme. When he met with Sue Gray recently this week, did he ask her not to publish this report?
No, Mr. Speaker, and what I can tell the honourable lady is that this is a wholly independent report, and the judgments contained in it are a matter for Sue Gray. I'm grateful to her. I'm grateful to her for what she has done, and I believe that it has been extreme. I think her interim report was extremely useful to the government in making the changes that we have.
The Bardell.
Mr Speaker, when the years to come, when the Prime Minister reflects on his time as PM and in government, what does he think will be his proudest moment? Will it be breaking his own lockdown laws and being fined? Will it be misleading Parliament? Or will it be lying to the Queen and presiding over such a toxic environment that, as according to Sue Gray's report, staff in his office had a lively party the night before her husband's funeral?
Mr Speaker, I will look back many years hence on from this period. I think the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe wasn't half bad. Being the first country anywhere in the world, Mr Speaker, to put an approved vaccine in anybody's arms, and to come out of COVID faster than any other European country, those are already very considerable achievements. To say nothing of delivering Brexit, which I'm afraid she would not have done, and nor would the party opposite, Mr Speaker.
Sarah Jones.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister was asked whether he thought any other Prime Minister would have allowed such rule-breaking on their watch. Well, I was a senior civil servant for two Prime Ministers, Gordon Brown and the Honourable Lady for Maidenhead, and I can tell him, when I was a senior civil servant, no such behaviour would have occurred. What is clear in the Sue Gray report, to me, is the number of comments of civil servants who knew they were doing something wrong. We seem to have got away with it. This is somewhat of a comms risk. People shouldn't be walking around waving bottles of wine in front of cameras, and it goes on. They knew they were doing something wrong. Did the Prime Minister, at any stage, at any of these events he was at, think he was doing something wrong?
No, well, I've tried to be clear with the House about that. And by the way, she talks about serving previous Prime Ministers. I thank her for her service, but I want to assure I've never thrown a stapler at anybody, or an ashtray, Mrs Speaker.
I'm in Newlands.
Thank you much, Mr Speaker. His utterances on Partygate at that dispatch box have proven to be the fantasy we all knew they were. Allegra Stratton resigned for merely joking about a party. She's more integrity in a little finger than the Prime Minister could ever hope of possessing. This charlatan of a Prime Minister is without shame, without credibility, and without any hope of ever winning another election. So does he agree that he will sacrifice anyone or any institution, including his own party, to try and keep his ever-weakening grip on power?
Mr Speaker, I know why they want to remove me from office. It's because we're going to get on and win the next election. And that's the reality.
Lynn Brown.
Speaker, maybe the Prime Minister could help me again. If no rules were broken, what on earth did Martin Reynolds mean when he said we got away with it? Referring, of course, to the Bring Your Own Booze party on the 20th of May. What did he mean, we got away with it?
Mr Speaker, I can't give an exegesis of what's in the report. She can read the report for herself.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. When the Prime Minister says he's sorry, we know he's sorry for getting caught. One of my constituents, Louise, was in hospital in November 2020. A very elderly woman lay in the bed next to her, crying and begging for her family. She asked Louise to phone and ask them why they hadn't come to see her. The last thing she said to Louise was, "I won't be here in the morning." She died with a student nurse holding her hand, which haunts Louise to this day. Does the Prime Minister agree with Louise when she says he's a liar and must resign?
I have every sympathy for Louise and all those who have suffered, but no, Mr Speaker, for the reasons I've given, I don't agree with what he's just said.
Stephen Farr.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister has presided over a culture of law-breaking, entitlement and privilege in Downing Street. He cannot credibly plead ignorance on that point. In his statement, he has sought to try to rationalise this by saying that the staff in Downing Street were working long, pressurised hours battling COVID. So what does he say to the thousands of doctors, nurses, care workers, the emergency services, cleaners, security staff and indeed civil servants up and down the country who didn't have alcohol-fuelled work events, parties or leaving dues?
Mr Speaker, I simply say to them what I've said since the pandemic began, which is I thank them from the bottom of my heart.
Steve McCabe.
When I previously asked the Prime Minister to release the publicly funded photographs of these incidents, he declined because of the police investigation. Is there any conceivable reason, Mr. Speaker, why the full publicly funded catalogue of these incidents should not now be released so that the public can see and judge for themselves?
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell him is that, to the best of my knowledge, I think all the evidence has been seen by Sue Gray and by the Metropolitan Police. There may be issues about what else can be released more generally, but he has, I believe, a representative. The public has, I think, a representative sample of the images.
Speaker, 5 times in a 5-page report, the Prime Minister indicates that he takes responsibility. But in actual fact, he hasn't, not once. During the pandemic, all MPs asked our constituents to adhere to the guidelines to protect themselves, their family, their friends, their colleagues and the wider community. Prime Minister, with the benefit of hindsight, do you believe you set a good example, one that you can look back with pride?
Mr. Speaker, where I fell short and where we fell short, I apologise. I want to thank all colleagues who asked their constituents to follow the guidelines. And I think, actually, yes, the government can be very proud of a lot of what we delivered during COVID.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've waited for this report, and looking through this report, it's clear to me that the Prime Minister did break the rules on one occasion when he was surprised by a birthday greeting between meetings in the Cabinet room. This is a rule breach, clear rule breach, but one for which he has apologised, and I accept his apology. It is also clear from this report that there was other examples which he was not present at and which he did not break the rules at, but which others did, that occurred repeatedly during the period of the lockdown. So I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, what has he learned from this, and how do the changes that he's put in place at number 10 make sure that such examples and the attitudes that allow them to occur will not persist now?
I thank her very much, and I think that my honourable friend from Lichfield asked substantially the same question. It's, I think, the lines of command and responsibility in number 10 are now much sharper, thanks to the installation of a new second permanent secretary with direct responsibility for everybody in the building.
Mr. Mathers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister must see that people partying until the small hours on a regular basis at Downing Street paints an awful picture to everybody else who has followed the rules. But I want to ask him specifically about the gathering in his flat on the 13th of November 2020, which, contrary to what he said today, hasn't been fully investigated by Sue Gray. Can he confirm, for the record, that everyone who was there that evening was working and that there was no alcohol, no music or anything else that people might reasonably conclude constituted a party?
I'm grateful to him, and I think I answered this already. I've got nothing to add to what Sue Gray says in her report or what the Metropolitan Police found in their investigation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister would love for these incidents to be swept under the carpet and for us all to forget about it. But the Panorama documentary and this Sue Gray report shows the utterly inappropriate and shameless behaviour that took place at number 10 during lockdowns. Now, the Prime Minister has said that he wants to appreciate his officials at number 10, and by doing this, he had parties that took place every Friday at 4 p.m, an open bar and excessive drinking. This is a way in which he appreciated his staff, and the Sue Gray report states the excessive consumption of alcohol is not appropriate in a professional workplace at any time. To take responsibility is to resign. The Prime Minister has said he's not going to do this. Can he say what he's doing now to appreciate his staff and officials at number 10?
I think what we're already doing, Mr. Speaker, is sharpening up the management of number 10, making it easier for staff to complain, to voice their anxieties. But you know, I've just got to say, Mr. Speaker, that we've got to get on with the business of government, and I know that she wants to persist with this subject, but I want those officials to focus on the priorities of the people.
Deirdre Brock.
Speaker. It's rumoured the Chancellor will shortly finally be announcing some further help for our struggling constituents with the cost of living crisis. But we know how things work in this government with its enormous team of spin doctors. Has his government deliberately held back the details of that desperately needed help in order to provide some cover for the damning impact of this report?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, like many in this country, have lost loved ones. My constituents have lost loved ones. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost loved ones. And the longer this goes on, the more traumatising their experience is. I can tell him that sitting through these statements is very traumatising for many of us who've lost loved ones and our constituents. That is why we cannot go on like this. Can the Prime Minister now do the decent thing, do the honourable thing, and accept responsibility and step down so that we can all move on and get on with our lives and make sure that people who've suffered so much are protected and served properly?
I thank her, and I of course, appreciate the suffering of those on whose behalf she speaks, but I do believe it is the duty of the government to get on as fast as we can with sorting out the priorities of the people now.
Can I thank Sue Gray for publication of her report? It's good to see the final article. We all recognise that there are many lessons to be learned from the handling of the pandemic from all levels of government, as the report states. Can the Prime Minister, working alongside devolved administrations, give an indication as to when he will be launching the public inquiry on COVID-19 that he promised? The general public have questions to ask and answers must be given. When will the general public have their say?
I thank him. As he knows, Baroness Hallett has been Heather Hallett has been appointed to head the inquiry, and he can expect developments soon.
Wait, David.
Mr. Speaker, it is absolutely imperative that the British public are told the whole truth. Everyone hopes that there have been no reductions or changes to this report. Indeed, Downing Street said its intention was to publish the report in full, in its entirety, unchanged. So can I ask the Prime Minister, did anyone in number 10 receive a copy of the report yesterday? And were any requests made for sections to be removed or altered? And following requests specifically, were there any changes made to the section relating to the gathering in the number 10 flat on the 30th of November 2020?
I can tell him that I received the report myself, and I'd not seen it before until shortly after 10 o'clock this morning. And on his second point about no, Mr. Speaker, no, on the second point about the events on November the 13th, I've addressed those several times.
But to Tom.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, now we know that while the Prime Minister was happy to let the bodies pile high outside Downing Street, he was also happy to let the bottles pile up high inside Downing Street. We also know that he's come to that dispatch box and denied point blank that events took place that we now know did take place and which turned Downing Street into the most notorious party flat in central London. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has diminished and demeaned his office, and he speaks of leadership, but any leader should know when it's time to go. Why won't the Prime Minister go so that the country can move on and move on as it needs to without him in office?
Mr. Speaker, I think what he's just said is unworthy of the civil servants, some of whom, I'm sad to say, were fined, who worked night and day to minimise suffering and minimise casualties during COVID.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Ruby Fuller lived by the motto, live kindly, live loudly, in pursuit of social justice. Ruby died from cancer on the 20th of May 2020 as the Bring Your Own Booze party was happening in Downing Street. Her grandparents and her young friends had to say goodbye to Ruby by Zoom. What does the Prime Minister have to say to Ruby's friends, young people in my constituency who are listening to him today blame everybody but himself And when will he accept that every single day he remains in Downing Street, our politics is corroded further?
Mr. Speaker, I repeat my condolences to those who suffered from COVID, to those who couldn't get the treatment that they needed during the pandemic, to the family of Ruby who couldn't see her when she was suffering from cancer. And all I can say now is that we want to get on with our work, which is to clear the backlogs, particularly for cancer patients up and down the country.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the bereaved families of justice, for the bereaved families of COVID, this report will unleash another cruel wave of loss and grief and anger. So, as a bare minimum, will the Prime Minister promise that the interim findings of the COVID inquiry will be published before the next general election?
That is a matter for the Chair.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. To those MPs that have clearly gone for their lunch, can I advise them that the Prime Minister's humble pie is off? But was the Prime Minister at the party on the 18th of December 2020, the so-called wine and cheese evening, which lasted for 5 hours and when, and I quote, red wine was spilled on one wall and the event was crowded and noisy, after which a cleaner was forced to clean this up. Was he at it at any stage of the proceedings?
I think you will find the answer to that question in Sue Gray's report.
I won't be asking.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The conclusion of the report states, Mr. Speaker, the conclusion of the report states that Ms Gray found that some staff had witnessed and been subjected to behaviours at work that are concerning, multiple examples of a lack of respect and poor treatment of security and cleaning staff. For me, that is the most damning, but also the most telling part of the report, Prime Minister. Why is it that people like him and the people at work at Number 10 think that cleaners, security guards, nurses, teachers are beneath them, less important than them? Why, Mr. President? Shame on you.
Mr. Speaker, I condemn such behaviour, and actually, when I was running London Transport, for instance, I instituted much tougher penalties for those who abused our staff. And I support tougher penalties for those who abuse shop workers, Mr. Speaker. And those are the values I stand for.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wine Time Friday, karaoke, grown men drinking shots of apple sours. How can anyone on the benches opposite honestly describe these as work events? Misleading the House is a very serious issue, as the Prime Minister well knows, but taking the people of this country for fools is far worse. And whilst he's busy trying to defend the indefensible, I'd like to know, Mr. Speaker, how many of my former colleagues does he think will be joining me on these benches after today?
That's the point. Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman will find the answers to his questions in the Sue Gray report. I really don't have anything more to add.
Dave Duggan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By the actions of this Prime Minister, standards of public life in the UK now lie face down in the gutter. The Prime Minister wants us all to move on collectively. Well, let me assure this derailed Prime Minister, there is no collective in Scotland of which you are a part. So as his authority lies festering in a steaming pile of incredulity, will he set out to the people of Scotland the productive and positive role he will play with the Scottish Government in allowing and enacting a referendum on independence so we can finally free ourselves of exactly the type of behaviour you typify?
Mr. Speaker, I will continue to work productively with the government in Scotland, as we did throughout the pandemic, not least in delivering the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, in the furlough programme, and everything else that we did together that shows that we're stronger together.
Rachel Maskell.
Mr. Speaker, in response to the question put by my honourable friend, the member for Wirral South, the Prime Minister said that he had not had time to apologise to the cleaning and security staff. Is he telling this House that Sue Gray and no official appraised him of one of the 8 conclusions of this report prior to him coming to the House today, or are they simply just not his priority?
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. Since I saw the report this morning, I haven't had time to be able to identify the custodians or the cleaners in question. But as I said earlier on to the honourable lady opposite, as soon as I can, I will apologise to them in person.
Christine Jardine.
Much, Mr. Speaker. I have been inordinately proud of the way my constituents and people up and down this country have dealt not just with the pandemic, but with the economic crisis that they now face. None of that is reflected in the shameful behaviour we see in the report. Earlier, much earlier, I see the Prime Minister look at his watch. One of his own colleagues suggested that perhaps we should want to turn the page on what has happened. And believe me, I think everybody in this place would like to turn the page and never have to revisit again. But the only way that we can do that is if the Prime Minister accepts responsibility fully and moves on, so we can turn that page.
Speaker, I am going to move on with the government's agenda, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that the Prime Minister struggles with the truth. But can he vouch to me and to this House that he will do everything that he possibly can to stave off his backbenchers and instead lead the campaign to protect his precious union?
More of that, please. Listen, Mr. Speaker, I think increasingly the strongest advocates of the union of the United Kingdom are the Scottish Nationalist Party, who, by their incompetence, their overtaxing, their poor educational results, they can't even make the trains run on time, Mr. Speaker. They can't even buy some ferries without totally screwing it up, Mr. Speaker. They are terrific advocates of the United Kingdom. I thank them for what they're doing.
Order. Order. Thank you. Presentation of bill. Presentation of bill, Secretary George Eustace.
Oh, tell you what.
No, just nod.
You're watching Sky News events wrapping up in the House of Commons. I am live at Downing Street this afternoon after the publication of Sue Gray's damning final report into those lockdown parties is published. It includes, as we've been hearing, descriptions and photos of parties, many of which the senior civil servant says should not have been allowed to happen. Also contained in that report, pictures of the Prime Minister drinking at events and details of others involved in excessive drinking and details of what has been described as a minor altercation. Well, the Prime Minister has come under fire from MPs on both sides of the House of Commons this afternoon, but he has defended his position, saying that he takes full responsibility for what happened. Well, let's remind you of some of what has been published by Sue Gray today, details of what took place, of the notorious Bring Your Own Booze party organised by the Prime Minister's then Principal Private Secretary, Martin Reynolds. The report says concerns were raised that it wasn't a good idea. But afterwards, Reynolds wrote, "We seem to have got away with it." Sue Gray also investigated a party that took place in the Cabinet Office on the 18th of June 2020. There, she found excessive alcohol consumption by some individuals. One individual was sick, and there was a minor altercation between two other individuals. Photos of a gathering for the Prime Minister's 56th birthday in June 2020 are published in the report. The report saying food, alcohol and soft drinks were provided, having been organised in advance. Neither the PM nor the Chancellor were aware that the event was being planned, but both were fined by the Metropolitan Police for attending. The Prime Minister told the House of Commons that he briefly attended Downing Street lockdown gatherings, but didn't know at the time that they went on far longer than was necessary. In response, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer accused Mr Johnson of showing utter contempt for the public, and that this report demonstrated the hubris and arrogance of the government.
I came to this House and said, in all sincerity, that the rules and guidance had been followed at all times. It was what I believed to be true. It was certainly the case when I was present at gatherings to wish staff farewell, and the House will note that my attendance at these moments, brief as it was, has not been found to be outside the rules. But clearly this was not the case for some of those gatherings after I had left, and at other gatherings when I was not even in the building. So I would like to correct the record, to take this opportunity, not in any sense to absolve myself of responsibility, which I take and have always taken, but simply to explain why I spoke as I did in this House. Mr. Speaker, in response to her interim report, Sue Gray acknowledges that very significant changes have already been enacted. She writes, and I quote, "I am pleased that progress is being made in addressing the issues I raised." And she adds, "Since my update, there have been changes to the organisation and management of Downing Street in the Cabinet Office with the aim of creating clearer lines of leadership and accountability, and now these need the chance and time to bed in. The entire senior management has changed. There is a new Chief of Staff, an elected member of this House, who also commands the status of a Cabinet Minister. There is a new Director of Communications, a new Principal Private Secretary, and another of other key appointments in my office. I am confident with the changes and new structures that are now in place, that we are humbled by the experience, and we have learned our lesson. And I want to conclude by saying that Mr. Speaker, I am humbled and I have learned a lesson, Mr. Speaker.
Even now, after 126 fines, they think it's everyone else's fault but theirs. They expect others to take the blame whilst they cling on. They pretend that the Prime Minister has somehow been exonerated, as if the fact that he only broke the law once is worthy of praise. The truth is, they set the bar for his conduct lower than a snake's belly. And now they expect the rest of us to congratulate him as he stumbles over it. Number 10 symbolises the principles of public life in this country: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, leadership. But who could read this report and honestly believe the Prime Minister has upheld those standards? The reason the British public have had to endure this farce was his refusal to admit the truth or do the decent thing when he was found to have broken the law. This report was necessary because of what Sue Gray describes as failures of leadership and judgment for which senior political leadership must bear responsibility. It is that failure of leadership that has now left his government paralysed in the middle of a cost of living crisis.
The former Justice Secretary, Sir Robert Buckland, pressed the Prime Minister on whether he had lied to Parliament.
My right honourable friend well knows the rules apply to him as much to all of us. And the rules of this House are clear that anybody who comes here and deliberately lies and misleads this House should leave their position, resign or apologise. My right honourable friend has been asked many times about specific incidents, specific events that Sue Gray has outlined. Has he on any occasion come to this House in response to specific questions about specific events and deliberately lied to us?
No, Mr. Speaker, for the reason I have given, that at the time that I spoke to this House, I believe that what I was doing was to attend work events, and with the exception of the event in the Cabinet Room, that is a view that has been vindicated by the investigation.
The former Conservative Minister, Tobias Ellwood, he was heckled as he asked how long the party would defend what happened.
This is a damning report about the absence of leadership, focus and discipline in number 10, the one place where you expect to find those attributes in abundance. I made my point and my position very clear to the Prime Minister. He does not have my support. But a question I humbly put to my colleagues is, are you willing, day in and day out, to defend this behaviour publicly? Can we continue to govern without distraction, given the erosion of the trust with the British people? And can we win the general election on this current trajectory? The question I place to the Prime Minister is now, Mr. Speaker, I'm being heckled by my own people. If we cannot work out what we're going to do, then the broad church of the Conservative Party will lose the next general election. But my question to the Prime Minister is very clear on the question of leadership. Can he think of any other Prime Minister who would have allowed such a culture of indiscipline to take place under their watch? And if it did, would they not have resigned?
Mr. Speaker, I think to answer the question that he put to all of us on these benches, I think the answer is overwhelmingly and emphatically yes, we are going to go on and win the next general election because we're going to get on with the job, Mr. Speaker.
And from the opposite side of the House, a Labour MP, Chris Bryant, was scathing about the way security staff were treated after they raised concerns about the gatherings.
What a load of baloney. Excuse after excuse after excuse, and it simply doesn't wash, and it won't wash with the British public, who are sick and tired of being taken for fools. The truth is, the Prime Minister encouraged the gatherings. He attended the gatherings. He poured the drinks at the gatherings. And he even raised a toast at the gatherings, so he knew perfectly well that these gatherings had taken place. And the most despicable thing of all is that Sue Gray says she saw multiple examples of a lack of respect and poor treatment of security and cleaning staff because they knew what the rules meant, even if nobody else does. Does he show no contrition, no sense of shame that Downing Street under him has been a cesspit full of arrogant, entitled narcissists?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said to the House already, I think that it is absolutely disgraceful in any circumstances to be rude to people who are helping you, and rude to staff, rude to custodians. It's intolerable, and I will make sure that those who are guilty of it apologise or are otherwise disciplined.
Well, there was some support for the Prime Minister from his own side and Conservative MPs who agreed with Boris Johnson that it was time to move on.
When I think of civil servants and advisers during that period, I think of the brilliant civil servants who helped move mountains to create the shielding programme within a matter of days. I think of the brilliant civil servants and advisers that got 90% of homeless people off the streets within days. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that these achievements and others should mean that nothing in this report is a stain upon the character of the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of civil servants, whether in number 10, other government departments, or across the country, who helped steer this country through the pandemic? And secondly, difficult though this is to say for many, with a war in Europe, with an economic crisis, with the challenges this country faces, is it not really true that it is now time to turn a page, and for this country, our politics and this House to move forwards?
I agree with him absolutely passionately, Mr. Speaker. I think the best thing, I think we can study the report, we can draw the conclusions that we want. The best thing now for our country is to move forwards together, and that's what we're going to do.
Well, just a flavour there of some of the reaction to the Sue Gray report in the House of Commons earlier on this afternoon. We can take a closer look now at some of the detail in that report. Let's bring in our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who's been studying it in full since it was published earlier on. Sam, what are your key takeaways from Sue Gray's report?
Good afternoon, Sarah Jane. 37 pages, taking us all the way from May 2020 to April 2021. Sue Gray trots through a whole series of different events that led to more than 80 people at the heart of power being fined, including the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. She paints a picture and draws her conclusions. What are the main takeaways? So, number one, she tells us that there was an unusual, an extraordinary culture of drunkenness at the very top of government. Now, I'm going to whiz you through a number of events where she helps us to that conclusion. Look at this. This is 18th of June. This was a leaving do for a Cabinet Office official. She talks about how this party, which was attended by the Cabinet Secretary and the Deputy Cabinet Secretary and the Ethics Advisor, brought her own karaoke machine. She says the event lasted for a number of hours. There was excessive alcohol consumption by some individuals. One individual was sick. There was a minor altercation between two other individuals, so there was a fight at the heart of power. So that was in June. Now let's fast forward to December. 3 different parties on one day, 2 of them in Downing Street. Let's see what Sue Gray found out about that. Some people working elsewhere in number 10 in the building that evening heard significant levels of noise coming from what they characterised as a party in the press office. A cleaner who attended the room in the next morning noted that there had been red wine spilled on a wall and on a number of boxes of photocopier paper. But one of the extraordinary things about the report is he discovered that as time went on, the behaviour got worse. Look at this. This is about Jane Slack, the former Director of Communications, leaving do, and that was in April 2021. Let's look at some of the details she highlights. A number of individuals gathered near a child's swing. Now, that's Wilf, the Prime Minister's son's swing and slide in the garden. Damaging it by leaning on it and playing with it. This was noticed the next morning and reported to number 10 staff. And look exactly how late this leaving do ended up being. Some individuals remained in the building and carried on drinking alcohol until the early hours. Exit logs, because they looked at the indicators of when people swiped in and out, indicate some left after midnight, others up till 2:45. 2 members of staff stayed later still, with one leaving at 3:11 in the morning and the last leaving at 4:20. The next big conclusion that she helps us to is the fact that they knew that there was rule-breaking involved because they were discussing the fact that it broke the rules. So let's look at the lead-up to the 20th of May 2020 Bring Your Own Booze party. And look at this. Lee Kane, another Director of Communications, Boris Johnson got through a few, says in an email to the most senior official in number 10, Martin Reynolds, we'll hear about him again in a moment, I'm sure it'll be fine, I applaud the gesture, but a 200-odd person invitation for drinks in the garden of number 10 is somewhat of a comms risk, a communications risk, a PR risk in the current environment. So he's there quite clearly warning. Now, that event, those warnings were ignored. 30 to 40 people ended up in the garden with the Prime Minister, and he was there for about half an hour. And look, after the event, Martin Reynolds, that most senior official in number 10, texted a special advisor who was saying the media are onto a different party story and said that that story is a complete non-story, but better than them focusing on our drinks, which we seem to have got away with. And you can just see, if you just flick across this report, lots of discussion between Lee Kane and Martin Reynolds, so advisors and officials, about whether who's going to take the risk, who's going to take the decision, who's going to get the blame. And look at this. 2 unnamed officials ahead of one event talking about when are we having drinks which aren't drinks? What time are we planning on the drinks? So they're quite clear, I think, that they knew that what they were doing was at least straining the rules, if not in breach. The third big thing about this report is what it tells us about the Prime Minister. And it helps us in this regard by printing some of the photos. So this is a photo of the Prime Minister's birthday, the Prime Minister's birthday party. And what it does is it reminds us that Boris Johnson was fined for being at this event, which he was at for 20 minutes, not the 9 minutes that Downing Street said he was. But here's Simon Case, now the most senior official in the whole of Whitehall. He wasn't fined. Apparently doing very much similar things to what the Prime Minister was, but he appears to have got away with it, so pressure on the police to explain some of their judgments. Another awkward photo for the Prime Minister is this one. It's a similar one to the one we saw on Monday. It is another Director of Communication, Lee Kane's leaving do. Here you have the Prime Minister raising a glass, huge amount of alcohol on the table. That looks like a vodka bottle there, and clearly some fairly cheapish white wine. The Prime Minister raising a glass to say goodbye. what was the judgment, the thinking behind the police when they decided not to fine the Prime Minister for that? But the third really important bit of what it concludes about what Sue Gray concludes about the Prime Minister relates to this. Potentially the most damaging moment for Boris Johnson was what happened in his private flat. Was there a party in his private flat after the departure of Lee Cain and Dominic Cummings, factions who didn't like them celebrating the Prime Minister's personal residence? And what Sue Gray was going to conclude about that was going to be incredibly important. Here it says, Sue Gray comes to her determination on that. Following the announcement, she starts to tell you what happened. A number of people went up to the flat after 6 o'clock.
Are you going to resign, Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister was there from 8. Food and alcohol were available. The discussion carried on later into the evening and with attendees leaving at various points. Aha, was that a party, you ask? Well, Sue Gray says that she's not going to tell us. Why? Well, the Metropolitan Police then, after she'd done some investigating, got involved and started saying that they were going to look at that event. The Metropolitan Police decided that they weren't going to issue any fines for what happened there. And Sue Gray says, following the Metropolitan Police announcement on the 19th of May 2022, I considered whether or not to conduct any further investigations in this event, but concluded it would not be proportionate or appropriate to do so. So what are Sue Gray's conclusions? She says, the senior leadership at the centre, both political and official, must bear responsibility for the culture of drunkenness that she found in her report. But that doesn't mean that she's calling for immediate action, because she then goes on to say, I am pleased with the progress that's been made in addressing the issues she raised in January about this. Since my update, there have been changes to the organisation and management of Downing Street and the Cabinet Office with the aim of creating clearer lines of leadership and accountability. In other words, the leadership's responsible, but there have been changes, and she's not suggesting an immediate different approach. So that actually gets both Boris Johnson and Simon Case, the head of the civil service, largely off the hook in that section. She does call for junior people not to receive excessive punishment, and she does seem to say that the culture in Downing Street and the top of Whitehall was out of line with the culture elsewhere in government departments. It is my firm belief, however, that these events do not reflect the prevailing culture in government and the civil service at this time, but it is not clear, Sarah Jane, exactly what changes flow from this report and what consequences Boris Johnson must face, for she does not spell anything specific out.
Sam, thank you very much. Multitasking here at Sky News as Sam was bringing us the details of the report. The Prime Minister arrived back here at Downing Street after answering questions in the House of Commons about the Sue Gray report, of course, published earlier on. Myself and a number of journalists here asked if he was going to resign. He didn't answer, went straight into number 10.